A serial killer is on the loose.
All the parents of the victims suffered a vision of absolute horror.
Can new, untested forensic science catch the psychopath before more women die and bring the beast of the Bastille to justice? After a late night out in July of 1995, 27-year-old Hélène Fricking heads home to her apartment in central Paris. Her body is discovered the next day.
This young woman had been raped and murdered.
Right away, police noticed the killer's ominous signature. Hélène Fricking's bra had been cut between the cups and her panties at the sides. The way she was bound and the ferocity of the 16 stab wounds bear a strong resemblance to two other violent sexual crimes under investigation by Paris police.
We discovered semen, and the analysis of this semen enabled us to determine a genetic code. It was the same genetic profile.
With the DNA match to the previous two victims, Paris police now know they are looking for a serial killer. The two other victims were 33-year-old Agnes Nieschamp, who was raped and murdered in December 1994, and 23-year-old Elizabeth Ortega, who was attacked at knife point only 3 weeks before Hélène Fricking's murder. Miraculously, Elizabeth survived the attack. Investigating magistrate Judge Gilbert Thiel takes the lead on all three cases linked by DNA. But these three are not the only beautiful young women to have been attacked recently in Paris. Judge Thiel is also given two additional cases, 28-year-old Catherine Rocher and 23-year-old Elsa Benedy. These two victims were raped and murdered in 1994, but not in their apartments. They were attacked in underground parking garages. Still, police have a gut instinct that all 5 cases are connected.
My colleague told me there's nothing that links these two cases to the case for which we have DNA. But she said to me, nevertheless, I think it may be the same perpetrator.
Catherine Rocher and Elsa Benedy had been killed in their cars, but their throats had been slashed with a knife, and they had also had their underwear cut in the same manner as the apartment murder victims. And in Elsa Benedy's car, police had found drops of blood spots on a leaflet, which they sent for forensic analysis.
In terms of traces for these crimes, there was very little. There was only a leaflet on which a bloodstain had been found, and we didn't know whether it was indeed linked to the murders. In any case, a genetic profile was extracted from the bloodstain.
Police now have 2 genetic fingerprints. One for the apartment murderer, and one for the parking garage killer. But incredibly, authorities never compared the 2 DNA profiles, and 2 separate teams handled the investigations. For the next few weeks, both of them continue to look for a suspect. Then, on November 19th, 1995, the parking garage killer team comes up with a name.
They had analyzed in all of France all of the people who could have the same way of working, and they realized there was a certain Guy Georges who had been sentenced for attacking a young woman in a parking lot.
Guy Georges is a 32-year-old vagrant with a troubled past. As a baby, he was abandoned by his single mother. His grandparents refused to care for him, so he was brought up by a professional foster mother, Madame Morin. Before he turned 17, Georges was jailed for attacking 2 other women. And most alarming of all, as an adult, he has graduated to sexual assault and rape, attacking 3 women in their apartments, and 1 in a parking lot. Now back in prison for the latest sex offense, Georges seems the obvious suspect for both recent crime sprees.
So they got Guy Georges out of prison. They took him to the Paris crime squad. They interrogated him. He didn't admit he was the perpetrator of the crimes, and they took a blood test from him to do genetic profiling.
The results of the genetic profiling are stunning. Guy Georges' DNA does not match the blood on the leaflet found in the back of Elsa Benedi's car. He is eliminated as a suspect in the parking garage killer investigation and handed over to the apartment murder team. But somehow, Guy Georges' DNA isn't tested against their samples.
At no time were we asked to compare Guy Georges' DNA with the other DNA, the DNA of the killer who was acting in the apartments.
Police do question Guy Georges about the apartment murders, but he denies any involvement. They also show his photo to Elizabeth Ortega, the victim who escaped out of her apartment window, but she doesn't recognize him. Police conclude Guy Georges is not their serial killer. He is sent back to prison to serve the remaining 2.5 years of his current sentence. The killing spree stops, but authorities dig even deeper into the investigation. June 1997. Guy Georges, a former suspect in a Paris killing spree 2 years earlier, is released from prison. In September, just 3 months after his release, 19-year-old Magali Serrati is murdered in her Paris apartment. Police are stunned. They fear the serial killer is back, although this time he leaves no DNA at the crime scene. But he soon strikes again. 26-year-old Estelle Magdi had been stabbed in the neck. Her underwear was cut in the same way as all the other apartment victims. And police find a blood-stained sweatshirt, which they send for forensic analysis.
We did a test on the blood sample and discovered that it was a mixture of 2 bloods. The blood from the victim, who had her throat slit, but also another blood, which happened to be the blood of serial killer number 1, which had been found in the previous cases of the murdered girls in the apartments.
News that a serial killer is stalking Paris hits the press. The chief of police issues an official warning, telling young women to be careful walking home at night in case they're followed. Panic spreads like wildfire across the city.
Judge Thiel says, "We can't go on like this. There's a lot of media pressure in Paris, and it's a real panic."
In desperation, Judge Thiel makes a bold move. He asks all the laboratories in France to search their genetic files to try to find a match to the serial killer's DNA. But Thiel's request is a huge invasion of privacy for the individuals who have their DNA stored on file, and it's also against French law. The labs ask for more time to consider what to do.
3 days later, one of the people in charge of all of the labs in France called me and told me, "Well, we will do what you asked, Your Honor."
In November 1997, French labs that store human DNA profiles start searching for the identity of the serial killer. Without any computer programs to run searches, each sample must be compared by hand. It takes 5 months, but on March 24th, 1998, Dr. Olivier Pascal at the Genetic Laboratory of Nantes finds a match.
I telephoned Judge Thiel, and I said to him, "Sir, I have 2 pieces of news to give you, good news and bad news." He said, "Start with the good news. I can guess what the bad news is." I told him, "We've identified the serial killer. It's Guy Georges. The bad news is we've had him for 2 years on our files, and if we had identified him earlier, the last 2 victims would still be alive."
It's a race against time to find Guy Georges before he kills again. Since he has no known address, police must search the entire city. On March 26th, 2 days after he was confidentially identified, Guy Georges is still at large. Police embark on a full-on manhunt to catch a killer before he strikes again. March 26th, 1998. Guy Georges is finally tracked down in Montmartre, Central Paris, and arrested for the gruesome murders of multiple young women. Despite a positive DNA match, he claims innocence.
He said he'd done nothing, and I gave him the names of some of his victims: Estelle Magdi, Eline Frinking, Elizabeth Ortega, and Agnes Nijkamp. At that point, he collapsed. He fell backward. I caught him by his jacket.
Judge Thiel is sure Guy Georges is the man who attacked the women in the apartments. But Georges continues to deny any involvement. But then, suddenly, he starts talking.
In the second half of the night, all of a sudden, he started to talk of the affair of Magli Soroti. He admitted it, when for that one, we didn't have the DNA yet. He confessed in detail.
This first confession opens the floodgates. Next, Guy Georges confesses to another case from 1991, 3 years before the most recent killing spree started, in which 19-year-old Pascale Escoffier was stabbed to death in her apartment. By the end of the night, he is charged with 5 murders of women in their apartments, plus the attempted murder of Elizabeth Ortega, who managed to escape. But Judge Thiel has a hunch there could be even more.
There were still the murders of the 2 girls in the parking garage, Catherine Rocher and Elsa Benadi, for which we didn't have DNA and whose files were still separate.
Guy Georges was eliminated from the parking garage investigation when his DNA didn't match blood found at one of the crime scenes. But that was before he'd confessed to being a serial killer. Now he's asked again if he killed Catherine Rocher and Elsa Benadi. He maintains he did not and is sent to jail to await trial. 8 months later, Judge Thiel decides to try one last time to question Guy Georges about the parking garage murders. He is interrogated for 10 hours. Finally, he starts to confess to the murder of parking garage victim number 1, Catherine Rocher. Then something incredible happens. While describing the attack, he inadvertently describes the crime scene of victim number 2, Elsa Benadi.
The interrogator showed him the photo of the naked body of Elsa Benadi in the car, and he said, "Yes, I'm having a flashback. I also killed this young woman." And then he shut down and became mute.
Police feel confident they have a solid case, but in fact, the fight is far from over. On March 19, 2001, Guy Georges arrives in court to stand trial for 1 count of attempted murder and 7 counts of murder. His defense team includes 2 renowned lawyers, Frédéric Pon and Alex Ursule. Despite all his confessions, the defense enters a plea of not guilty.
When I met him, I met someone who seemed calm and confident and level-headed, and I felt that it wasn't him, that he was being wrongly accused.
Guy Georges' counsel believes they can put forward a strong defense. They intend to claim he can't be the killer because he wasn't recognized by Elizabeth Ortega, the victim who escaped. Secondly, they plan to undermine the fledgling science of DNA analysis and point to mistakes in procedure. Their client confidently agrees to have his DNA retested.
We told him, "The strong evidence against you is this DNA assessment, but this is open to criticism. So are you ready to redo a DNA test?" And he said, "Yes, of course."
The prosecution opens the trial. Family members of the victims are in court to see the man they believe robbed them of their loved ones. They sit together only yards from Guy Georges.
The confrontation in the court of Assize, which is a magnificent room, very large, but the parties are quite close, so the confrontation was very, very intense.
The families are scheduled to testify, but before any of them take the stand, the prosecution calls the defendant himself. Until now, he has appeared calm and in control. But under the spotlight of cross-examination, Georges starts to show his true nature.
One of my colleagues asked him a question on how to use a knife. And instead of answering, he made a hand gesture which transfixed the whole court because we felt we saw him in action.
Guy Georges raises his hand in a violent gesture. The courtroom is shocked.
So that's when it started to turn. And from that moment, he became a bit angry. He felt he had been trapped. He dug in his heels, he withdrew, and he started to no longer answer the questions which he found difficult.
Guy Georges leaves the stand, but his confident persona has started to crumble. As witnesses to their client's obvious discomfort, the defense team starts to realize his story may be a lie. But more than that, they sense that Guy Georges is undergoing a psychological shift.
J'ai senti qu'il avait besoin
I could feel that he needed to confess.
d'avouer.
And I also felt he couldn't do anything else but confess.
Pas faire autrement.
For his own dignity.
La dignité des choses d'avouer.
Advocate Ursulé makes an extraordinary decision to help his client in a most unprecedented manner. He calls Guy Georges to the stand and talks him step by step through his confessions.
His lawyer gave the name of each victim. Guy Georges, do you admit killing Miss Escofet? Yes. Do you admit killing and raping beforehand Miss Rocher? Yes. Miss Benedi? Yes. Miss Nijkamp? Yes. Miss Frinking? Yes. Miss Saroti? Yes. Miss Magdi? Yes. And do you admit attempting to kill Miss Ortega? Yes. So there we are.
It's the closure the victims' families have all been waiting for.
And so from that moment, the pressure completely died down.
On April 5th, 2001, Guy Georges is sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 22 years. Outside the courtroom, the relief is palpable. The trial of Guy Georges ushered in a major change in French law. Following his arrest in 1998, the government bypassed their strict privacy rules and sanctioned the creation of a DNA database for sexual offenders. It is still used to catch rapists and murderers today.